Okay, lecture 2 of Gaddis. Okay, and this is chapter 3 from his book. Here. Okay, so the Cold War is a competition to organize societies, as we've already discussed. There's two ways of seeing the world. One is known as the East, and it's directed by the Soviet Union and with its occupied territories and what we didn't understand at the time, but we now know to be just allies, the Chinese. And then on the other side is the West. Again, the United States is at the head of this, and also our allies, the British, the French, states that are aligned with us. And then the rest of the globe is an arena of competition where newly emerging states, as we shall discuss in our next lecture on the Cold War, newly emerging states are targets for gathering influence and making allies. So this competition is not just a military or even diplomatic, it's an entire different way of seeing the world. That is, a way to think about it is the way they organize society. So we have the Soviets, their Marxist system. It's a function of their revolution and the, as they understood it, the logical imperatives of Marxism, which is that the ruling class, the ownership class, must be overthrown by the proletariats, the working class. And the working class is not just the working class in Russia or the Soviet Union as it becomes, but they're part of a global class. So the Soviet Union, as they see it, is in the vanguard. So this logic of Marxism, they anticipate, is something that will sweep the globe. And so this is their logic, how things are organized. As we discussed last time, the way this is structured is the dictatorship of the proletariat, which is a strong central leader and party whose task it is to defend the revolution and also to educate the citizens in what it means to be a socialist and eventually with the goal of becoming a communist society. So on the other side, we have the West. And the thing to bear in mind is that Marxism didn't arrive out of nowhere. It arrived out of the systematic disenfranchisement and I guess impoverishing the working class that we saw during the Progressive Era, where you have a small strata of super wealthy, the plutocrats, and the vast laboring poor working in desperate circumstances. That is the milieu that Marxism grew out of, and it's something that is occurring in the West as well. So in fact, Marx was a German and was talking about the German workers. That's what he envisioned. And also he and Engels spent a lot of time talking about the British laboring class. So the anticipation is that this is something that is ripe for overturning the system when the workers throw off this plutocratic elite. This is a problem that the West faced as well. But the way the West addressed this is what we saw in the Progressive Era to a certain extent and the New Deal to a greater extent, but also a widespread in Europe is fixing the inequalities through a type of social welfare program, a program designed to smooth off the rough edges of unbridled capitalism, which was resulting in vast inequalities. So in the West, they also have to address this issue, but their addressing is not of a radical overthrowing of the entire system of capitalism, but is instead a system designed to provide for people within the society. And that provision comes from extracting some measure of wealth, whether it's through corporate or private taxation, on those people who have enormous sums of money, with the idea that the state is collecting those things to provide for the larger populace. So the way the West addressed this problem is through social welfare, much less radical than the violent revolution of Marxism. And these ways of seeing the world are encapsulated nicely by two world visions and two world leaders. The first is Lenin, who leads the revolution in the Soviet Union, who crafts this system of how socialism is going to be governed and maintained in the Soviet state. Then you have Woodrow Wilson, who ran as a progressive in the 1912 election, but his vision is markedly different because they're visions of not just how our country or the Soviet country is going to operate, but with a vision for how the world should be organized. Lenin's vision is of a spreading class struggle. Wilson's vision is for spreading democracy, that when people are given the opportunity to choose their own governments, they will choose governments that reflect their interests. So you have two different world visions. There's a dictatorship of the proletariat, if we're speaking in official jargon, that Lenin espouses. And then we have this global democracy idea that is encapsulated by Woodrow Wilson and things like the League of Nations and the 14 Points. One privileges equality. Under this, at least the theoretical vision of Marxism, all are equal. So it privileges this idea of equality as an end goal, as a status the world should seek to achieve. For Wilson, it's privileging liberty, individual liberty. When people have a choice in choosing the governments and how they operate, they will choose governments that are reflective of their interests. So this is an anti-colonial as well as a broadening of democracy in a variety of states, right? So there are two different ways of organizing societies, and they're in conflict. Coming out of the Second World War, we have these two different societies organized around two central principles, and the question is, which one prevails? So for the, let's shift this time, instead of talking about the Soviets first, let's talk about the United States first. So for the US, what are the lessons they learned of the war and the run up to the war? Well, one of the crucial lessons they learned, or they incorporated into their governing philosophy, let's say, is that it's absolutely imperative that the United States be involved. That the United States fumbled its opportunity coming out of World War I by withdrawing into isolationism. And isolationism has a strong streak in American history. So the Roosevelt/Truman administrations were very fearful about this tendency to turn your back on obligations and rights in a wider world. So this was something that Truman, building upon Roosevelt, really sought to emphasize, is that absolutely imperative that the United States should be involved. And so the United States didn't just agree that some sort of League of Nations, now known as the United Nations, would be formed. The United States took the spearhead in creating that, right? The United Nations was a creature of a rebirth of the League of Nations, really driven by primarily Franklin Delano Roosevelt and then Harry S. Truman. So this vision of collective security that is manifest in the idea of the United Nations. And we see with Franklin Delano Roosevelt's vision of the four policemen, this entity of collective security as a key element of the vision of how these things would operate. That's how things work on sort of the diplomatic range. They also have this vision that economic chaos is dangerous. One of the things the United States saw as being responsible for the rise of Hitler and other fascists was the collapse of the economic system of the Great Depression. So economic chaos is dangerous. It foments radical action and revolution. So they want to prevent that from happening. So as part of this, out of the wreckage of the Second World War, the United States built some new global institutions, which the United States was going to be the primary donor and backer. So you have the creation of a World Bank, whose vision or whose mission is to make large loans to countries that need it in all sorts of ways. So you can use it to get low interest loans to rebuild your infrastructure, to expand your infrastructure, to do things, to make monies available on a very large scale for nations to use. So a World Bank. You have a Bretton Woods Agreement, which is a economic compact in which the United States again would play the largest role and take the largest lead in that. You have the International Money Fund, which is about creating and maintaining safe currency and the stability of currency around the world, using the strong United States dollar as a backbone, but designed to ensure that there's not this rampant inflation that you saw in things like the Weimar Republic, which undermined the integrity of the German government which led to the replacement of its Weimar Republic with the fascist state of Adolf Hitler. So all these things are collective actions, which the United States is not just going to be a member, they're really the ones who are creating these things and putting up the support to make it run. The United States and the Soviet Union have competing ideologies, right? So there's the way the Soviets see the world, the dictatorship of the proletariat, where the outside world is seeking to overturn it, so it needs protection. Then you have the security system embellished or embossed by Joseph Stalin, whose vision of security, his butt at the top, is about controlling other states to ensure that no entity could come from Central Europe and threaten them again. So in order to maintain themselves in power, the Soviets rely upon the application and the use of terror. They terrorize their citizens at home, and they terrorize the occupied territories. That terror is how they maintain themselves in power and protect the regime. But this terror is a problem, right? How do you entice people to join into a terrorized system? How do you get them to say, please join our side, and then we're going to install this police state that's going to ensure our safety, right? Meanwhile, the United States is offering a different model. The United States wants to preserve capitalism, and the way they see preserving capitalism is by renewing and reinforcing democratic states. We've already talked about the Marshall Plan, about pumping huge amounts of money into these states to allow them to recover in infrastructure, in economic terms, in the ability to produce for their citizens. These are all things that are part of this large influx of Marshall money. And then you also have states that were occupied. So in the occupied states of Germany and Japan, in the sectors that the United States and the Allies controlled, they went around installing democracy, helping the citizens, educating the citizens in how democracy works, and creating the basic infrastructure of these governments, which would then be filled by either Japanese or Germans. In fact, the United States wrote the Constitution for the Japanese government, which is modeled a lot on the United States Constitution, as you can imagine. So this idea of installing a democracy into these places. We began this course talking about Reconstruction, and one of the failures, or at the root of the failure of Reconstruction, is there is not a sustained effort. Well, Reconstruction scholars were of very intense interest to the Roosevelt administration and the Truman administration, because they want to take a look and see what didn't work. And so they wanted to make changes. So the vision of what they're going to do in Japan and Germany is a much larger occupation effort, trying to create a new style of government. And another thing that the anti-lessons, I suppose, or the lessons you learn from the failure of Reconstruction. In Reconstruction, they didn't get the white Southern population to buy into the system. So under this system of occupation, Japan and Germany, there's a concerted effort to convert these people. And these people are willing to be converted, let's say, because the destruction of Germany and Japan was so horrendous, and the crimes of their respective governments were so awful, that they were open to this idea, but it had to be very carefully managed. And so the United States is going to spend an enormous amount of time and resources trying to build up these states so they're self-ruling, not an occupied state. In the Soviet Union, with the death of Stalin, and eventually the emergence of Khrushchev, Nikita Khrushchev, as the single power and control, Khrushchev comes to power, and his experience working up through the communist regime, the Soviet regime, he was a man of the people, right? So he was in the countryside, so he understood the problems and the challenges these people in the Soviet Union countryside faced. And he recognized that the absolute fear of Stalin was successful in keeping Stalin in power, plus the thousands upon hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of people that he had slaughtered, were successful in keeping Stalin in power, but they were undermining the Soviet state's abilities because people were so terrorized that they weren't as productive, and that this system of control of the satellite states, as they were referred to, is a constant effort. It's exhausting to continually be seeking to keep an eye on all your citizens and punishing those for getting out of line and making examples. So Khrushchev saw that this was hobbling the Soviet state. He also knew how far behind they were against the West, and they also understood in ways that the West did not understand in what desperate circumstances the Soviet state was in economically. So Khrushchev seeks to undo this. And what he wants to do is to loosen or remove the boot heel of the Soviet state from the throats of these occupied nations and to give them a little bit of say in how things are running in their own state. He believes that by opening up these occupied states, that these states will be more helpful partners and will be more effective and efficient. And he signals this in a dramatic fashion. He gives a speech to the Politburo in which this marathon speech, he lays out the mistakes by Joseph Stalin and hints at them being as sort of crimes. The terrible things he did to his own citizens and the terrible things he did to the occupied states. The idea behind Khrushchev is by admitting our mistakes, then we can move forward with turn the page and start this new relationship. But this came as a shock to Soviet members of the Politburo, and this long speech was either accidentally or probably purposely, leaked so that people could read it. And it was a shock because one of the things about the Soviet rule of order is that the dictatorship of the proletariat doesn't make mistakes, that they have a plan. So everything that happens is a result of a plan. There's no mistakes in the Soviet system. So for Khrushchev to say Stalin was making mistakes, this was a shock. And then also to suggest that his relationships with occupied states like Czechoslovakia, of Hungary, these places that are under Soviet control, that this too would be that this was not handled properly was also shocking. So shocking that an East German minister had a heart attack upon reading this report or this copy of this speech. So Khrushchev's vision is by removing some of this oppressive terror that the states would, embrace it. What happened though was once that boot heel of Soviet occupation pressure is off the throat of these states and they're giving a little bit of their own say in how things go, a little bit of freedom, if you will, they want more. And what they want is to get the Soviets out of their country. This was not something that Nikita Khrushchev expected or intended. And so when it began to bubble up and there was unrest, this was a threat to the Soviet system. And we see it first or most prominently in Hungary in 1956. The government authorities, Imre Nagy, which you will see a little bit of that in the final film, when he is talking about being responsive to the interests and the demands of the people, and they're talking about, we got to get the Soviets out, this becomes intolerable to the Soviet state. Khrushchev sees that given a little bit of freedom, they want more, and their number one demand is to get the Soviets out of their state. But of course, with this issue of security, that's a non-starter. So Khrushchev is forced to crack down on this nascent independence movement. So he sends the tanks in to Hungary, and they squash the rebellion by running over the protesters and with tanks. And then he has Imre Nagy arrested and executed. Again, this is assigned to other client states, other occupied states behind the Iron Curtain, as is referred to, part of the Warsaw Pact states, right? The states that are under control of the Soviets. This is a lesson to other states you can't get out of line. So Khrushchev is forced to reinstall this sort of draconian terror system. Meanwhile, another communist leader, Mao Zedong in China, sees this effort to repudiate Stalin, and he views it with alarm because he doesn't see this as the right path to take for communist states, and certainly doesn't want that in China. So Mao's not interested in saying, we should be less onerous to our people and the occupied states. Mao says Stalin has it about right, and I want to be more like Stalin. So he's not interested in what Khrushchev is selling. So there's tensions between the Soviet Union and China, which were not understood or well understood at the time, become apparent in retrospect. And so Mao seeks to tighten his control over the state, his dictatorial control. This is often trotted out, properly I should say as well, that this is the fatal flaw, or one of the many fatal flaws in a totalitarian system of government, in which the central authority is so powerful that people follow his every whim, and they're afraid to tell the dear leader differently, that things aren't running so well. So Mao Zedong, as he understood this Marxist view of the future, the way Marxism is supposed to work is that the industrial workers of the world, and of individual countries, will throw off the aristocratic or pseudo-aristocratic or plutocratic, the wealthy ownership class, will overthrow those who own production, the means of production, and replace it eventually with a collection of workers who will share equally in everything that is produced, right? But these are industrial workers. That's the theory that Marx is crafting, and he has a whole theory about how you move from a feudal system where you have peasants working in rural populations, becoming a capitalist system, and then, as Marx sees it, replaced with the socialist and eventually communist system, that this is a way things progress. Well, the Soviet Union was not terribly industrialized, although there's some of it, but China is not industrialized at all. In many ways, they were still in that sort of peasant-based rural economy that marked feudalism. So to Mao's thinking, he says, we're going to jump over that industrial worker capitalization phase, and we're going to jump right into the Soviet system. He called it, the socialist system, he called it the Great Leap Forward. China is going to leap from a peasant farming-based economy to a modernized industrial country, but skipping that capitalist state idea where you have owners and workers, and going right into where all the workers are part of this modern industrial factory system. So Mao decides that that's what China is going to do. So he issues an edict that says, stop farming and start making steel. And he orders everyone to immediately set up backyard steel furnaces where you're going to produce steel that will go into constructing a modern industrial China, right? So the order goes out, and he says, if you don't have enough firewood to burn, then burn your farm implements. The key is everybody must suddenly start producing steel, because steel is how you build a modern industrial economy. So this order goes out. It's called the Great Leap Forward, and it is a disaster. It's a disaster, well, for the obvious, simple, obvious reason that making steel, as we saw in our previous discussions, requires extraordinarily high temperatures. Right, and there's a process, and a very exact process that you have to go through to produce this steel. You can't really do it in your backyard, and you can't really do it with burning your farm implements or grass or whatever. So everybody goes about making steel in these backyard furnaces, right? The town, village, whatever, builds all these little furnaces, and they're producing useless steel slag. It's not useful for anything. But meanwhile, while they're doing all this, they're not doing the things they used to do, farming and raising food. So they're producing this steel that's worthless. They've used, in some cases, they've burned their own farm implements, and they haven't planted any of the staples, especially paddy rice, that are necessary. So what happens after the growing season in these regions is that there's a massive famine. Large sectors of China had hundreds of thousands, millions of people who were starving to death. But nobody would tell Mao because nobody wanted to tell him that his Great Leap Forward was a disaster. So the resulting famine, best guess, and we don't really have good records, but the best guess is that this famine killed 30 million people in China. It's a self-created, man-made famine because of Mao Zedong's ideas of the Great Leap Forward. In this system, everyone's so fearful of Mao, in the same way they were fearful of Stalin, that nobody will tell him different. And so the harebrained schemes of this dictatorial leader resulted in the direct starvation of somewhere around 30 million of his citizens. In Europe, right? So if you look back on the maps that are on Blackboard from Berlin and Europe, you see that Berlin is located deep inside East Germany, right? This is a sort of a display case of the two systems of government. The problem is the West Berlin, the United States, the French, and the British sector combined into one section known as West Berlin is recovering very nicely. To be fair, some of that is because the Allies made a concerted effort to make sure that West Berlin began to recover very nicely because they understood that this is part of the display of two different ways of viewing the world. On the other side of that line that separates Berlin into East Berlin under Soviet control, they're not doing as well. West Berlin is a beacon of capitalism and recovery and opportunity, and it's right there in the center of East Germany, and it's right there on the other side of the street, literally, for East Berliners. So West Germany and West Berlin are outstripping, recovering East Berlin and East Germany, and they can't keep up. The East German state, even though they received an enormous amount of assistance from the Soviets, who understood the propaganda aspects of making East Berlin look nice, but they couldn't compete because the system is so inefficient. So you have a capital city, Berlin, which is split between East and West, and which is a very real example of which side is more successful for their citizens. So as you can imagine, people in East Berlin said, I want to go to the other side. So they did. There's a subway line, or there was a subway line that connected East and West Berlin. And so you can get on the subway and get off and be in the West. And so people began to emigrate out of East Germany. And they began to emigrate out into West Berlin, where it was the policy of the West German state. And anybody who sought asylum in West Berlin, if they wanted, could be immediately transported to West Germany and be given subsidies from the state to get them started on their way. So people were voting with their feet. They were marching out of East Germany and East Berlin into the West side and seeking asylum. And the Soviet and East German state couldn't stop them. It was getting to the point where there was 20,000 people a month who were walking across to the other side. And what is most damaging of all for the East German state and the Soviet Union by extension is that the people that were doing this walking were the best and the brightest. They were the young folks who were educated, who saw in West Berlin and West Germany and the West in general much greater opportunities than existed in the East. And so they were leaving. This hemorrhaging of people and the best and brightest people from your society, it cannot continue, or the society will collapse, even with the police state terror imposed by East Germany and the Soviet state. So the Soviets were at wit's end. What are they going to do? And they were putting pressure on these Germans who were also at wit's end. And so they came up with a solution, not a very nice solution by any stretch, but a desperate solution. They put up a wall, and they put up a wall overnight. in 1961. They began to erect barbed wire barricades, and they posted guards who were tasked with preventing people from leaving East Berlin and going into West Berlin. This wall, constructed virtually overnight, in some cases they were literally tearing up the roadway to construct the wall, became what was this very layered system of obstruction that becomes known as the Berlin Wall. The wall was, at the time, unusual, if not unique, in world history. It is the first wall set up between the border of two states, not to keep your enemies out, but to keep your own citizens in. So this Berlin Wall, which went up in 1961, ratcheting tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union, because this was designed to prevent people from leaving this system through force, is the genesis of the Berlin Wall, which, as we shall see, comes down in 1989, triggering the end of this occupation system. But that's for the future. So that's where we are with Gaddis's lecture 2. And we will pick up next time. Next time I will do the civil rights lecture. All right, stay healthy.